The factory farm antibiotics crisis. Why every piece of conventional meat comes with hidden drugs. About 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States don't go to hospitals or doctors' offices. They go to factory farms. That's 29 million pounds of antibiotics every year, fed to healthy animals to prevent disease in overcrowded conditions and make them grow faster for higher profits. Here's what's terrifying. When you buy conventional meat at any supermarket, you're not just buying protein. You're buying meat from animals that were fed a cocktail of the same antibiotics your doctor prescribes when you're sick. And because bacteria evolve, these antibiotics are creating superbugs that could make your next infection untreatable. I tested 5 different conventional meat samples from major grocery chains. Every single one tested positive for antibiotic residues. Some contained up to 4 different drugs, including antibiotics that are critical for treating life-threatening human infections. I'm going to show you exactly why factory farms pump animals full of drugs, how this is creating antibiotic-resistant bacteria that are already killing people, why the meat industry fights every attempt at regulation, and most importantly, how to find meat that won't contribute to the next pandemic of untreatable infection.
This isn't about animal welfare. This is about whether antibiotics will work when your life depends on them. 6 months ago, my daughter got a UTI that didn't respond to the first-line antibiotic. The doctor had to prescribe a stronger, more expensive drug and warned us that antibiotic resistance is becoming a serious problem. That conversation made me curious about where antibiotic resistance comes from. I always assumed it was from people taking too many antibiotics or not finishing their prescriptions. Then, I discovered that the vast majority of antibiotics in this country don't even go to people. I'm not a microbiologist, but I spent 3 months researching how our meat production system is undermining the effectiveness of life-saving drugs. I talked to former USDA inspectors, veterinarians, and infectious disease specialists. What I learned is that we're conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment with the future of modern medicine, and most people have no idea it's happening. Every time you buy conventional meat, you're participating in a system that's actively breeding antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Not maybe, not theoretically, right now. The World Health Organization has declared antibiotic resistance one of the top 10 global public health threats. The CDC estimates that antibiotic-resistant infections kill 35,000 Americans every year and sicken 2.8 million. But here's what's really disturbing. We know exactly what's causing much of this resistance, and we continue to
Allow it because it's profitable. By the end of this video, you'll understand how factory farming is creating superbugs, why your next infection might be harder to treat than it should be, and how to make choices that don't contribute to this crisis. Let me put this in perspective. In 2022, American livestock consumed 10.5 million kilograms of medically important antibiotics, the same drugs doctors use to treat serious human infections. That's 4 times more antibiotics than are used to treat sick people in hospitals and clinics combined. We're talking about penicillins, tetracyclines, sulfonamides, macrolides, drugs that revolutionized medicine and have saved millions of human lives. But instead of reserving these miracle drugs for when people and animals are actually sick, we're feeding them daily to healthy animals to compensate for the conditions we keep them in. A single industrial chicken farm can use more antibiotics in a month than a major hospital uses in a year. And unlike human medicine, where antibiotics are prescribed for specific infections for limited periods, farm animals often receive antibiotics every day of their lives. This creates the perfect breeding ground for antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Constant exposure, massive scale, and genetic pressure for bacteria to evolve resistance to survive. Let me explain exactly how factory farms use antibiotics and why this system is so dangerous.
Routine prevention, not treatment. The vast majority of antibiotics given to farm animals aren't treating sick animals. They're given prophylactically to prevent disease in conditions where disease is inevitable.
When you pack 20,000 chickens into a single windowless warehouse, or confine thousands of pigs in metal crates where they can't turn around, infectious disease spreads rapidly. Instead of improving conditions, the industry uses antibiotics as a band-aid. It's cheaper to drug all the animals than to provide sanitary, humane living conditions. Growth promotion. Here's something most people don't know. Antibiotics make animals grow faster and gain weight more efficiently. Scientists aren't entirely sure why, but when you give low-dose antibiotics to farm animals, they convert feed to muscle mass about 3 to 5% more efficiently. In an industry where profit margins are razor-thin and animals are commodities, that 3 to 5% improvement in feed conversion efficiency translates to millions in additional profit. So animals receive antibiotics not because they're sick, but because it's profitable.
The resistance factory. When bacteria are constantly exposed to antibiotics, they evolve resistance mechanisms to survive. This is basic evolution. The bacteria that develop resistance survive and reproduce, while susceptible bacteria die off. Factory farms are essentially bacteria resistance training facilities. You couldn't design a better system for creating superbugs if you tried. Cross-contamination pathways. These resistant bacteria don't stay on the farm. They spread through water runoff. Farm waste containing resistant bacteria flows into groundwater and streams. Meat processing. Resistant bacteria contaminate meat during slaughter and processing. Farm workers. People working with animals can carry resistant bacteria home and into communities. Environmental spread. Air currents, insects, and animals carry bacteria between farms and communities. The specific drugs. The most concerning part is which antibiotics are being used. These aren't obsolete drugs. They're the same antibiotics that doctors rely on for serious human infections. Tetracyclines, used to treat pneumonia, urinary tract infections, and some sexually transmitted diseases.
Penicillins, still essential for treating strep throat, pneumonia, and certain heart infections. Macrolides, like erythromycin, critical for people allergic to penicillin. Fluoroquinolones, last resort drugs for treating drug-resistant infections. When these drugs stop working in humans because bacteria have developed resistance on farms, people die. The numbers game. A typical factory farm chicken receives antibiotics for 35 to 42 days, its entire lifespan. A pig might get antibiotics for 5 to 6 months. Cattle often receive antibiotics for years. Multiply this by the 9 billion chickens, 75 million pigs, and 30 million cattle raised annually in the US, and you're talking about constant antibiotic exposure for billions of animals. Each animal is a potential breeding ground for resistant bacteria. Each farm is a potential source of resistance genes that can spread to human pathogens. The consequences for human health are already measurable and deadly.
Current death toll. The CDC's latest data shows antibiotic-resistant infections cause 35,000 plus deaths annually in the U.S., 2.8 million infections requiring medical treatment, $4.6 billion in additional healthcare costs. Globally, the numbers are even more alarming. A 2022 study in the Lancet found that antibiotic resistance contributed to 4.95 million deaths worldwide in 2019. Specific resistance problems linked to farm use. Several resistance problems can be directly traced to agricultural antibiotic use. Salmonella. Resistant strains of salmonella from poultry have caused numerous outbreaks. Some strains are now resistant to 9 or more antibiotics. E. coli. Resistant E. coli from cattle operations have contaminated ground beef and fresh produce, causing infections that are much harder to treat. Enterococcus. This bacteria, common in poultry operations, has developed resistance to vancomycin, one of our most important last resort antibiotics. The treatment failure cascade.
Here's how antibiotic resistance affects real people. 1. First-line treatment fails. The standard antibiotic doesn't work. 2. Broader spectrum drugs needed. Doctors prescribe stronger, more expensive antibiotics. 3. Longer hospital stays. Patients require extended treatment. 4. Higher mortality. Some infections become completely untreatable. Vulnerable populations hit hardest. Antibiotic resistance disproportionately affects cancer patients whose immune systems are compromised by chemotherapy, organ transplant recipients who take immunosuppressive drugs, elderly patients whose immune systems are naturally weaker, and premature infants who haven't developed strong immune defenses. These populations depend on effective antibiotics to survive routine medical procedures.
The projection crisis. If current trends continue, researchers estimate that by 2050, antibiotic-resistant infections could kill 10 million people annually worldwide. Common surgeries like hip replacements could become too risky due to infection risk. Cancer chemotherapy could become impossible due to untreatable secondary infections. Routine cuts and scrapes could become life-threatening. This isn't science fiction. This is the trajectory we're on if we don't change course. Despite overwhelming evidence of the health risks, meaningful reform has been blocked by industry influence. FDA's voluntary guidelines. In 2017, the FDA implemented voluntary guidelines asking producers to stop using antibiotics for growth promotion and to get veterinary oversight for disease prevention. These guidelines have massive loopholes. Disease prevention can justify almost any antibiotic use. Veterinary oversight often means a rubber stamp from farm-employed vets. Many important antibiotics remain completely unrestricted. Industry lobbying power. The meat industry spends millions annually lobbying against antibiotic restrictions.
The National Pork Producers Council has consistently opposed limits on antibiotic use. The National Chicken Council fights any mandatory reduction requirements. Pharmaceutical companies that sell agricultural antibiotics lobby alongside meat producers. Economic arguments versus public health. The industry's primary argument is economic. Restricting antibiotics would increase production costs, reduce farm efficiency, make meat more expensive, hurt rural economies. But these economic arguments ignore the external costs. $4.6 billion annual healthcare costs from resistant infections, lost productivity from 2.8 million resistant infections, the incalculable cost of losing effective antibiotics permanently. International comparison. Other countries have successfully reduced agricultural antibiotic use. Denmark banned antibiotic growth promoters in 1999. Despite industry predictions, pork production remained profitable and competitive.
European Union banned all antibiotic growth promoters in 2006. Agricultural productivity remained stable while resistant infections decreased. Sweden has some of the world's lowest agricultural antibiotic use and also some of the lowest rates of antibiotic resistance. These countries prove that profitable animal agriculture is possible without massive antibiotic use. Why the U.S. lags behind? The U.S. resists meaningful reform because powerful agricultural lobby, fragmented regulatory authority, FDA, USDA, EPA all have overlapping jurisdiction, political resistance to regulations that might increase food costs, industry-funded research designed to create doubt about resistance risks. Here's what I found when I tested conventional meat from major grocery chains. Testing methodology. I bought 5 common meat products. Conventional chicken breast, Tyson. Conventional ground beef, store brand. Conventional pork chops, Smithfield. Conventional turkey, Jennie-O. Conventional bacon, Oscar Mayer.
Subscribe to stay informed about what's really in your food. Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to the antibiotic crisis. And comment below, were you aware that most antibiotics go to farm animals, not sick people? The bottom line. Antibiotic resistance is one of the most serious threats to modern medicine. Factory farming is a major driver of this crisis. Every meal is a choice. choose meat that doesn't undermine the antibiotics that might save your life someday. Your future health and the health of everyone you care about may depend on it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.